I got my start in social media before it was even called social media. I was Canada's first forum moderator for Nintendo. You can see my little Italian plumber friend here. Hopefully, you know what brand he's indicative of. He is, of course, the mascot, the poster boy of Nintendo. And this is probably not something you were expecting. Okay, so he's a video game guy, but he's talking about digital marketing. Where's the connection? If you think about it as a forum moderator, certainly there are ways that we can look at forums as being the earliest iteration of message boards. Okay. So, what is a forum? A forum is essentially a group of like minded individuals who get together with the sole purpose of discussing something, often in a moderated discussion. And that moderator, what is their main goal there? It is to inform or drive a purchase decision. So, I signed on thinking to myself, okay, great. They just need somebody up in Canada to put the letter U in the word color. Unbeknownst to me, there was a lot more to it. And that was certainly my first foray into digital marketing and blogging and kind of growing my presence. The beauty of brand affiliation from being started out as Nintendo's first forum moderator is that my personal blog, as a result of that brand affiliation, benefited from clout. Right, it benefited from clout in such a way that I saw my monthly active users and my monthly readers climb from 5,000 to 10,000 to 50,000 to, oh my goodness, someone sent me a literal check in the mail. And I cannot tell you, as somebody who was an 18-year-old kid in the early 2000s, I know I'm going to be dating myself, but ad revenue in online marketing was not being taught in schools, right? In my upper year university courses at Canadian schools, they were not being taught yet. So this was more than a novelty. It was desperately needed at a time when I'm sure many of us are coming out of adolescence and into early adulthood and don't have two pennies to rub together. So I would positively strut to the mailbox every time I was pleasured enough to get an ad revenue check. I would do a little bit of dance. And I remember on one particular warm fall day, I went to the mail. I extracted a check, or at least what I thought was a check, but it was not a check. It ended up being a cease and desist. Now, for anybody who may be unfamiliar with the term, that is essentially a big, scary, lawyer written note that says, stop doing the thing. And there, in terms of a penalty, was a number. And all I will tell you about that number is that there were a lot of zeros. It had so many zeros, in fact, that it was the only time in my career that I decided to willfully put the muzzle on. And I did. I went dark. And I thought, you know what, this is going to be the end. I'm going to actually start to create a portfolio and get a real job after school. Lo and behold, everything that I had built was working for me, and that was serving as my portfolio. I did get a couple of calls from companies who said, what you've done with community building online is essentially what we're trying to do from a brand perspective. Would you be interested in having a conversation? Well, I'm proud to say that a conversation turned into a job in the industry turned into a career in the industry. And over the past 15 years, I've worked at some of the biggest brands in the world, including Staples, American Express, Microsoft as a consultant. And for the past 6 years, I've been at KPMG, where I now head up all aspects of digital marketing, including web, social, SEO, podcasts, webcasts, analytics, and of course, influencer relations. All this to say, you are in good hands. It's for today's session. But first, for any naysayers in the room, and in my experience, is usually at least one, let's just table stakes do some really cool water cooler facts that talk a little bit about what the social landscape looks like in the year 2021. To start off, if we were to take the monthly active user bases of all of the major social platforms and treated those users as citizens, populations of a country, Facebook would be the largest country in the world. Of course, number two and number three represent flags of actual countries, but if we go down to number four, we see YouTube, which is coincidentally, not really coincidentally, but Google's own YouTube is the second largest search engine in the world. Number five, and I'm curious if anybody is in the Q&A and you know what this is, please don't say Pengu. But if you've ever seen this before, what app is this indicative of? I'm not going to wait because I know that we don't have a live chat box here, but essentially, this is Tencent's QQ. Why you may not have seen it is because it's used predominantly in the Eastern world. Why it's important for us to talk about today is because it is certainly giving way to the killer apps that we are seeing make its way to the Western world. As an example, if I was using this chat client in the Eastern world or any of its competitors, I would be able to go to Kenneth and say, hey, Kenneth, we need milk. Full disclosure, Kenneth and I don't live together. It's just the first example that came to mind. But as I said to Kenneth, hey, we need milk, in our conversation, the word milk would show up hyperlinked. I'd be able to click and then choose a depot that triangulates my position so that without deviating off my path home, I would be able to essentially one stop shop and allow for myself to pick this up. And that would essentially be how we get our stuff all from a conversation. If we were sitting here together in a big auditorium, I'm sure right now I'd look out and I would positively see horror on the faces of people. I want to be very clear. That's not a level of privacy I want infringed upon. I consider it to be invasive as well. But it's equally important for us to understand this is the way that the world is going, especially as apps that have been purely social now look to add a layer of monetization. Number six would be also Facebook owned WhatsApp. Number seven, Facebook owned Instagram. Number eight, LinkedIn, the biggest B2B network owned by Microsoft. And number nine would be Twitter, of course, 10 being the United States of America. Now, why do we do this? Why are you listening to this? Whether you're building a professional or a personal brand, what is the output of this? I promise you, if at any point in my career I had gone into any boss or CEO's office and said, "Hey, we got a retweet and about 12 likes on that last post. Can I have a raise?" Forget a raise. I wouldn't have a job. This is all about generating meaningful influence with our online interactions. If we are not generating meaningful influence with what we're doing with our social media strategy, whether it's pre-pandemic, pandemic, or post-pandemic, we have certainly done something wrong. We have left something on the table is probably a more accurate way to look at it. Coming to the end of my water cooler stats, this one's particularly hilarious. Now, it's recently been debunked for its scientific validity, but I don't care because it frames my anecdote beautifully in terms of what we're going to be talking about today. The attention span of the American goldfish has been measured at roughly 8 seconds. Okay. Contrast that against the North American adult male at 7.6 seconds. Hilarious, as I said, maybe a bit debunked scientifically, but this is a digital marketing conference, so we don't need to really worry about that. Why do I tell this stat? What does it illustrate? This is exactly how small or how short our opportunity is as marketers to resonate with our audience. And you don't have to take it from me and my debunked fact. Think about your own behavior. For those of you who commute in to maybe a city center for work, whether you're taking some sort of train or a carpool, maybe a subway or a streetcar, how often have you glanced over to the neighbor to your left or your right and you've seen them and their behavior with their phone is essentially that where they are scrolling incessantly, so much so that their fingers and their screens don't come to a complete stop. That is the essentially the level of attention that we are getting from our audiences. It tells us just how high of a quality our content really needs to be of. Now, a couple of questions that I get literally every time that I do this talk. So let's just bang them out right now in hopes that we can have a deeper conversation by the time Q&A rolls around in a few minutes. The first one is big bets. What are the big bets that I have? Um, Essentially, for me, the big bet is unchanged from 2020 to 2021, it remains video. The stat to reinforce this now, two-thirds of all content online is video based. That's mind boggling if you think about it, right? Every day, every second on YouTube, literal hours, millions of hours, in fact, are being uploaded. We cannot keep up with how much content is being produced. Video is the way in which we as consumers have voted that we want to receive information, and now brands are responding in kind. Okay. And you don't have to take it from me again. Think about your own personal feeds. How far do you have to go down a Facebook feed, an Instagram feed, a LinkedIn feed before you encounter an auto playing video? I teach a course at a Canadian college, and we used to play this game in class wherein people would open up their Instagram, and the first person to encounter an auto playing video on their feed as they started to scroll down would shoot their hand up. And I kid you not, when we started playing that game took about maybe 6 to 10 seconds. Now, when we play that game, it's instant that almost every single hand in the class goes up. And that just tells you about the prevalence of auto playing video and our reliance upon it. The next thing I want to talk to you about is a fundamental question in analytics that digital marketing, specifically social media, has flipped right on its head. And that question is, if you can't measure it, is it even worth doing? And of course, there's going to be a lot of knee jerk reactions here, especially from anybody who has proficiency in some platforms like Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics, to just say, no, absolutely not. Because if we can't measure it, we can't iterate for success. How do I know if my marketing dollars are working as hard as they could on social, or perhaps I could be using them in another budget, right? Well, that was all well and good, and it was certainly true until the emergence of something in the industry that we call dark social. Not sure if many people have heard of this term before, but dark social refers to all of those conversations that we can certainly have on social media, but we cannot track. What am I talking about? Think about an expiring Snapchat conversation, an Instagram story that after 24 hours is going to become inaccessible. Well, can I change your perception in that time? Absolutely. But do I have perfect analytics the way I would through a conventional sales or marketing funnel to essentially reinforce when I'm converting somebody? Not so much. So this is an example of where conversations need to take precedence over the analytics, and that's something that I'm pretty excited to be at the forefront of, the emergence of dark social. I need a very strategically placed sip of water right now, so I'd like to pose a somewhat rhetorical question to the group. In one word, what do you think social media is about? I have collected a few answers. Feel free to put it in the Q&A if you like. Otherwise, just mull it over to yourself, and I'll tell you some of the most common ones. But I am looking for one. There are no wrong answers here. At the same time, I do feel that there is one that should always govern our social media strategies. I'll give you a second to think about it. Okay, some of the words that I hear commonly: connections, community, emotion. Some people get a little bit dark with it. They say things like vanity. These are all great words. The word that I want you to always keep at the forefront of your mind as you are thinking about your interactions, your companies, your professional or your personal brand on social media, it has to be conversations. Because if we are not having conversations with our social media strategy, if that is not the output, we are leaving something seriously on the table. Okay. There is one anecdote that I can tell you that illustrates this beautifully. It also happens to be the most hurtful thing someone has ever told me in my professional life. It was said to me by my old colleague, Paul. I'm going to paint you a picture of Paul. Paul's a lovely man. He's in his mid 50s. He's kind of clinging to that last bit of hair. He should drop the top, but he hasn't. He wears chunky glasses like me, and he's always in his graphic tees. Why am I telling you this? Because I really want you to visualize the individual when I tell you the most hurtful thing that he's ever said to me and anyone's ever said to me in my professional life, which is that he doesn't believe I should have a job. Ouch. Right. And it's not that he thinks ill of my experience or that he could do it any better. Paul just always believed that social media could do nothing for brands but breed bad press. They were all negative conversations. And that's why at one point, Paul was proud to tell me his brand was nowhere on social media. So, like anybody else would, instinctively, I ran to Google and I typed in his company name. And he was right about one thing: there were no owned properties that ever came up. But what happens when you type something into Google? Does nothing come up, or do literally hundreds of millions of hits come up? And three things came up that absolutely mortified him. Number one, misinformation, more commonly called fake news today, that is sometimes used by smaller players in the industry that can't, throw their weight around with the same level of ad budgets. That was number one. Number two, there was really good recognitions and rewards. They'd won, essentially as a company, some customer satisfaction awards offline, of course, but there was no central community to amplify that. And so it fell dead in the water as soon as it was published. And finally, perhaps most saddening of all, there were genuine questions from would-be customers, prospects trying to do business with him, but because there was no one to talk to, it just sort of went out there in the Twitter sphere. As I said, Paul was mortified, and he went home and he set up a LinkedIn company page and a Twitter account. And in the next year alone, he saw a spike in sales amongst millennials as well as Generation Z of about 20%. Why do I tell you this? These conversations that are so important that govern everything that we do online, they are essentially going to be happening with or without us. So it's really just about whether or not we want to take part. So let's talk a little bit about the three top trends that we've observed have emerged throughout the pandemic. The first one is a bit of a changing of the guard. It's pretty interesting. And I'm going to ask you another rhetorical question as we talk about it. It's about the evolving nature of how we trust. How much do you trust? Okay. For me, I usually have that split second hesitance right before I give my car keys to a valet. I kind of say, what if, kind of creeps into my mind. And I used to think that I was alone. But the way that we give trust or a lack thereof has certainly changed. I'll illustrate this with an anecdote. Has anybody ever heard of Ariana Renee? Ariana, or at Ari on Instagram, she's a Miami based social media influencer. She catapulted to online stardom in 2019 and has more than 2.6 million followers, all before she could legally buy alcohol. But I think with that type of clout, she could probably find somebody to slip her a beer. Of course, with her account blowing up, Ariana wanted to monetize on this platform. Who wouldn't, right? And she wanted to start her own fashion line. Now, the company producing her fashion, her clothing brand, informed her that to just get an initial run at the factory, get into production essentially, all she needed to do was sell at least 36 shirts. And she couldn't do it. Now, you're probably thinking 36 shirts doesn't seem like that much, especially if you've got a girl guide or two in the family. But when this story in particular hit the Twitter sphere, every marketer worth a damn turned to their colleague and said, what is the value of 2.6 million followers if we can't sell 36 shirts? Now, you could probably point to a poor marketing plan leading up to the launch, or an aesthetic that didn't really match what her brand or her persona stood for on the platform. These could have been major contributors to the failure. But here's an alternate alternate theory, one that's actually panning out quite nicely right now. What if the influencer bubble is bursting because we don't trust them the same way that we trust our peers? Now, it's been known for a long time that celebrities can be hired, right? They promote your products, and doing so often gives brands some good value. They get additional reach as well as a boost of sales. Win win, you think, right? That's why they do it. But as we've seen these partnerships come to an end, the influencers and their followings move on to the next one. And this leaves those brands that they've worked with largely in the same starting position. So you have to wonder from a social media perspective, was there any long term benefit to the partnership? Was there any way to build or deepen relationships to sustain the growth and the engagement online, really keep the lights on instead of just paying to play every time that you needed to sell something in the context of one of your marketing campaigns? And that is where we enter the micro influencer. The micro influencer, you may have heard them. They go by a few different names. Micro or nano is the most common one for those people who are essentially highly influential, but on a much smaller scale. Often their niche is hyper specific. And although this means that they have a significantly smaller following than most celebrities you've seen, it also means that they have intensely engaged audiences. In other words, when a micro influencer talks, their network actually listens. Now, micro influencing isn't some passing fad. You may look at this and say, okay, this is an emerging trend of the pandemic. What if it doesn't persist thereafter? No, it's actually not just a play on sales on Instagram, it's at play in our own lives every day. Now, if you think about your own life, for example, how often has it been that you've made a big purchase? Think about a television or a car, and you probably didn't make that big purchase decision in isolation. Now, unless you're a tech aficionado or a gearhead. Odds are, on that purchase that mattered a great deal to you, given how much of your hard earned money that you were spending at the time, you probably asked for the opinion of one or a few trusted sources that were very close to you. This is essentially what micro influencing is. Consumers make decisions every day on testimonials from complete strangers. That's how entire farms of fake reviewers start cropping up in the Eastern world. Once again, we see that trust takes one step forward to establish, but also two steps back. It gets called into question once again. But unlike celebrities who may or may not command the spotlight, the same level of spotlight next year, this is essentially the personal relationships that we are looking at, right? Micro influencers, because we don't really know where some of these celebrities who are tied to brands are going to be in a year's time. But there's one thing we do know about personal relationships that have been forged. Not only do they usually persist over time, they typically grow and deepen. And our relationships have never been as important nor as resilient as they are coming out of the pandemic. Now, the next trend that I want to talk about, you probably noticed this at play in your own life, but we are seeing this trend of brands speaking with a voice that is overly sentimental. I can't speak for everyone in this room, but if I hear the phrase unprecedented time once more, I may make throwing up on command my new normal. And the phrase became rampant with brands that were trying their very hardest to sympathize with audiences. But depending on who was publishing that sentiment, it was often seen as being disingenuous. The result was a wave of mostly indistinguishable campaigns, which I'm sure many of us are guilty of as well. And they were quoted. We were getting a lot of quoted tweets, but it was for the purpose of mockery rather than flattery. So who did it right? Which brands actually jumped on the trend for the right reasons? Coca-Cola, for one, pulled their ad spend and redirected those efforts into the COVID response, and they never forgot to prioritize that listening and that engaging on social. The campaigns that stood out during the pandemic were the ones that provided that much needed breath of fresh air. This is exactly why people turned to social media in the first place. According to Hootsuite's 2021 social trends report, 32% of key demographics say that finding funny or entertaining content is their main reason for using social media. Data from Morning Consult shows that useful and entertaining ads are most likely to drive purchases as consumers increasingly crave the return to normalcy. This is why we've seen an influx of people centric accounts at companies rather than those big faceless entities. People are far better equipped to exhibit real emotion than the big faceless corporate accounts. Being authentic on social media is nothing new, but it is now more important than ever. Well, who else did it well, right? That's Coke. I mean, Coke does a lot of things well. Another great example came from Coors Light. Rather than regurgitating the same old verbiages about, unprecedented times, they took a much more lighthearted approach. On social, they used the hashtag could use a beer to encourage customers to nominate someone who quite literally could use a beer during the pandemic. And then they sent out 500,000 beers to those grateful customers. Not only did it generate a ton of positive traction online, those are 500,000 pieces of user generated content. That is essentially what we had at our disposal for everybody to say, wow, I got this right now. Thanks so much. Coke, thank you so much. Bud Light, thank you so much. Coors. And now the last trend that I want to talk to you about today, it's about this fixation that we have on the market. One of the advantages of using social media to communicate your message has always been immediacy, right? That hasn't changed. And while this is still very much important, many of the brands who flourished during the pandemic, they took a sit back and listen approach as opposed to just publish, publish, publish. And what they achieved were high levels of engagement and positive sentiment. In some cases, all-time highs. Let's talk about one of the all-time highs. If you haven't heard this story of Nathan Apodaca, you really need to. It's a fantastic one. The story goes that Nathan was one day driving to work when his car battery died. Horrible situation. He still needs to get to work though, so he reaches into the back seat. He takes out his wakeboard. He sees no other choice than to just take that longboard and go the rest of the way downhill. And in a stroke of luck and/or genius, he decided, you know what, I'm going to record myself. And as he did it, he was lip syncing to the song "Dreams" by Fleetwood Mac, and he was drinking from a large bottle of ocean spray. If you haven't seen the video yet, you need to, because it's pretty much going to be listed in Webster's dictionary as the definition of chill. And his carefree vibe struck a chord on TikTok, and the video went viral. People around the world started recreating the video, chugging ocean spray while skateboarding, wakeboarding, surfing, running, skiing, and more. And pretty soon, celebrities like Gordon Ramsay himself, influencers, even US state governors had jumped on the trend. But that's not all. Even the drummer of Fleetwood Mac, Mick Fleetwood, whose band was featured as the soundtrack in the viral video, created an account to join in on the trend. And with everyone and their mother jumping on board, you can imagine most brands would too, but Ocean Spray stayed silent for over a week. And when the time was right, their CEO recorded the video on TikTok himself. And to go with that, they sent him a truck that was, of course, filled with ocean spray. Ocean Spray essentially capitalized on their position. They sustained engagement rather than jumping into the conversation right away. And if you ask me, most importantly, they gave back to the original content creator, which propelled them into the spotlight in the first place. Ocean Spray has been inundated with positive comments and praise from social users for their authentic and thoughtful response to this trend. And really, that's what we're talking about today. As I come to a close, I want to just reiterate that from micro influencing to a shifting brand sentiment to the lowered reliance on immediacy, social use during the pandemic has absolutely changed the way that brands and creators will approach platforms, as well as during, after, and probably before the pandemic as well. So it's important that we evaluate all of these key nuances, these emerging trends in the context of our personal and professional brands. With that, in about a minute to spare, I will pass it back over to Kenneth in case there are any questions from the audience.
Comment that just came through. I just remembered J. Mike just brought up Stevie Nicks did one too. I remember seeing
Oh my God, yeah, just
This
unreal, right?
the Stevie Nicks one.
It
It
was
was yeah,
everywhere.
brilliant moment. So
Unbelievable.
I do have a couple of quick questions. We've got
Please do.
about 1 minute.
Absolutely.
So one of the questions that I wanted to bring up was for KPMG.
Hmm.
Are you working with any influencers, micro, macro now? Have you seen that? Because I know that's somewhat a little bit different in the B2B world than
Right.
say a brand that's B2C or D2C like Tropicana.
Yeah, in terms of the firm, I can talk a little bit about what we're
Yeah.
doing. So we've seen much better value. I put up a slide that was actually a chart. It was real marketing data off a campaign. The relationships that we're able to forge with our micro influencers has just been tremendous, and that's why as the world goes on, I'm actually more inclined to create my own internal roster than tap into those large voices that are going to make me, essentially bend and break to their brand. And then, as we said, it's a drop in the pot and they move on to the next one. So certainly I am very intrigued and we are using micro.
Here's one more. Where do you recommend we start with activating personal brands?
For me, it's, LinkedIn will continue to be the bread and butter. It is the biggest, B2B social network. Every day, every second of every day, you get two new people on LinkedIn. That is really the playground for where we're trying to drive, marketing leads and generation.
Fantastic presentation, Adam. The vaccine becoming more prevalent, I think now finally in Canada, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, we are. It is kind of becoming more readily available. We've been trying to catch up to you guys. Story of our lives, I suppose. So, I sincerely hope that we get a chance to do this in person next time.
Thank you very much. Fantastic presentation.
Thank you so
All right,
much.
buddy.
Enjoy
Have
the
a
rest of
great
your day.
day.
You too,
Bye.
brother.